wish the world was as clear to me. I studied rocks and geological strata. I know that the Earth is round and that it moves, but what shape the universe is and where it's going, I don't know. Stars have been discovered rushing with almost the speed of light away from us to the borders of the universe. And I can't rid myself of the feeling that one day someone will prove that the universe is like a snail shell coiling in on itself with an interior and no exterior. And that these same stars that are rushing away from us are in fact on a collision course with us. There are mathematicians working on these theories. They call it curved space. It's like this. A man hangs himself from a rope in a tree and just dangles there on his rope. Now, how many ropes would he need to be absolutely still? How many points of reference so that his position is fixed in a three-dimensional space? How many? One. One additional rope would do it. Then he wouldn't move anymore. But how many ropes would we need? How many ropes would the Earth need to be absolutely still in the universe? Because everything moves. How could we become absolutely still? And what would these ropes be tied to?
You white men are lost. You don't understand the land. Too many silly questions. Your presence on this earth will come to an end. You have no sense, no purpose, no direction.
The country is not run by the visible leaders. It's run by the hidden hand, which is probably the intelligence community.
Mr. President, back to the question of troop reductions. Are any intended in the Far East at the present time, particularly in Korea? And is there any speed up in the withdrawals from Vietnam intended?
Well, as you know, when Secretary McNamara and General Taylor came back, they announced that we would expect to withdraw 1,000 men from South Vietnam before the end of the year. And there's been some reference to that by General Hawkins. If we were able to do that, that will be our schedule. I think the first unit, the first contingent, would be 250 men who are not involved in what might be called frontline operations. It would be our hope to lessen the number of Americans there by 1,000 as the training intensifies and is carried on in South Vietnam. As far as other units, we will have to make our judgment based on what the military correlation of forces may be. We are becoming increasingly mobile, as the big lift operation suggests. What is important in the case that Mr. Smith was talking about, we not only have these divisions that I described there, but we have, after the 61 experience, we moved equipment for 2 more divisions. So during the big lift, we actually have 7 divisions, so that we're able to move around the world much faster, and with new planes which are beginning to come off the production line, particularly ones in Marietta, Georgia, out of Lockheed and so on, we're going to have increased airlift capacity over the next 2 or 3 years, so naturally our force will be more mobile.
Roger Craig only had a 5th grade education. He ran away from his home in Wisconsin at age 12. He made his own living on ranches in the northwestern United States until he joined the Army at age 15. He accidentally ran into one of his brothers in the Army, and on learning his proper age, he was kicked out of the Army. He came to Dallas here and washed dishes until he was old enough to rejoin the Army. He rejoined the Army, had a fine combat record in Korea, came back to this city where he was hired by Sheriff Bill Decker at age 21 as the youngest deputy sheriff that Decker ever hired. Craig had a fine record as deputy sheriff, was made the Man of the Year in 1960 as the outstanding deputy for the year, and his troubles only began when John Kennedy was killed in this plaza on November the 22nd, 1963.
Roger Craig was a trained, alert, and instinctive police officer. He was interviewed by Lincoln Carl in April 1974.
Where were you on the day of the assassination of John Kennedy?
I was standing out in front of the sheriff's office, which at that time was at 505 Main Street. They've moved it since then, but it was at 505 Main Street, directly in front of the front door.
Was the motorcade passing that area at that time?
No, we had to wait about 15 minutes before the motorcade arrived, but the sheriff had sent us out there that early to wait.
Were you merely a spectator, or were you on duty?
Well, no, I was on duty, but a couple hours before Kennedy was to arrive, the sheriff called us in, what I call the street people, the plainclothesmen, the detectives, and he instructed us that we were to stand out in front and in no way take part in the security of that motorcade. That we were merely spectators and nothing more.
Did that seem unusual to you?
It did to me at the time, because there were so many people around and so few Dallas police officers. This is one of the first things I noticed, was the lack of Dallas police officers. Try to keep the people back.
Adlai Stevenson, who had been assaulted in Dallas the previous month, and others, including Congressman Henry Gonzalez from San Antonio, Texas, had warned President Kennedy not to travel through Dallas. But the Secret Service told the president that he had nothing to worry about, since the greatest security in the history of the country for an American president, comprised of the coordination of all the local and federal police, had been set up for Dallas. Yet Roger Craig, an intelligent, instinctive police officer, and many other police officers were specifically told not to take part in the security that day. And Dallas-based FBI agent James Hosty, assigned to Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald who had just returned from the Soviet Union, Oswald who was a high security threat by FBI standards, Mr. Hosty had no assignment to protect the president that day either. Hosty told a Congressional Investigating Committee many years later that he was having lunch down the street when the president was killed. The greatest security ever? Even the normal security on both the federal and local levels had been stripped away.
The president came by and they made the right turn on to Houston Street. And, I'll say, a few seconds later, give them time to get to Elm Street and make the left, I heard what I call a report, a gunshot. And I said, oh my God. And I turned and started toward Houston Street, running just as hard as I could. And I was probably 15 steps from Houston Street. And before I reached those 15 steps, I heard two more reports.
Then you arrived at Elm Street?
Right.
Okay, what did you see?
Well, there was a Dallas police officer running up the grassy knoll to the picket fence. So I immediately assumed the motorcade had left by then. And I immediately assumed that he knew something about the shots, or he wouldn't have been headed for the picket fence. So I followed him.
Were you aware the president had been hit?
Not at that time. Now, people were mentioning the president was shot, and someone else said a Secret Service agent was shot, and there were just stories flying all over. But my interest was to get behind that picket fence, because that's where that Dallas police officer was headed. And he was in the motorcade. He was he was a traffic officer. I worked in that area for, probably 7, 8 minutes, maybe something like that, until I ran on to Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Rowland. Now, Mr. Rowland told me that 15 minutes before the motorcade arrived, he saw 2 men on the 6th floor of the schoolbook depository. Now, one was a white male in the east corner of the 6th floor with a rifle. The other one was a colored male at the west end of the 6th floor, pacing back and forth.
Although Craig had not been assigned to the motorcade detail, he began gathering evidence and taking statements from witnesses almost immediately after the shots were fired. His interview with Rowland was important, for if Rowland saw 2 men on the 6th floor, one of whom held a rifle, then the Warren Commission's preconception of a lone assassin would have been challenged immediately. Craig noted and accurately repeated Rowland's words, although the FBI agent who had also interviewed Rowland in Dealey Plaza did not. Rowland told the Warren Commission when he testified, quote, "The FBI agents didn't seem very interested in the other man on the 6th floor," close quote, and that the FBI agent, quote, "deleted and omitted any reference to the other man in his report to the Warren Commission."
And I went to the south side of Elm Street to look for any signs of any bullets striking the curb or the street or anything. By this time it had been established that the president had been shot. And Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters joined me at that time. Everybody was coming to the scene of the shooting, which is normal. People are just that way. It had been determined that the shots came from the southeast window. How, I don't know. The Dallas police were saying this, so we immediately went there. And Deputy Sheriff Luke Mooney was with me when we found the shells. We found 3 hulls beside the window on the 6th floor. And they were laying 3 in a row, not more than an inch.
This was brass, the 3 spent cartridges.
3 spent cartridges. They were lying 3 in a row, not more than an inch apart, all pointing in the same direction. Of course, I didn't touch them. They hadn't been photographed or fingerprinted or anything. I didn't touch those. And there was a lunch sack, very small, brown paper lunch sack up there. Had some chicken bones in it. And there was a soda bottle sitting on a box. And we began then to search for a weapon. And we started toward, everybody took a different direction, and Deputy Sheriff Boone and myself just happened to head for the northwest corner of the building. And Boone was ahead of me by about 8 feet. And there were a stack of boxes just at the head of the stairwell going downstairs. And Boone looked over into it and said, "Here it is. Here's the rifle." So I immediately went over beside him and looked over, and there was a rifle. But we didn't touch it until Captain Fritz and Lieutenant Day from the ID department of the Dallas Police Department got there. Now, Captain Fritz was chief of homicide, and Lieutenant Day was from the Identification Bureau. They got there and took some pictures of the rifle, and then I believe Dave pulled the rifle out and handed it to Captain Fritz, who held it up by the, had a strap on it. He held it up by the strap and asked if anyone knew what kind of rifle it was. Well, by this time, Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman had joined us. And Weitzman was a gun buff. He had a sporting goods store at one time, and he was very good with weapons. And he said it looks like a Mauser. And he walked over to Fritz. And Captain Fritz was holding the rifle up in the air. And I was standing next to Weitzman, who was standing next to Fritz. And we weren't any more than 6 or 8 inches from the rifle. And stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser. And that's when Weitzman said it is a Mauser and pointed to the 7.65 Mauser stamp on the barrel.
There's an intonation to that statement that it should mean something.
Well, the shells we found came from a 6.5 Italian rifle.
You mean those 3 cartridges?
The two don't relate.
3 cartridges that were
found at the southeast corner
in the southeast corner
came from a 6.5 Italian carbine.
The strongest element in the case against Lee Harvey Oswald was the Warren Commission's conclusion that his rifle had been found on the 6th floor of the book depository building. Yet Oswald never owned a 7.65 Mauser. When the FBI later reported that Oswald had purchased only a 6.5 Italian Mannlicher Carcano, the weapon at police headquarters in Dallas miraculously changed its size, its make, and its nationality. The Warren Commission concluded that a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano, not a 7.65 German Mauser, had been discovered by the Dallas deputies. Yet Roger Craig's observation was supported by this affidavit signed by Dallas Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman on November 23, 1963, in which he swore that he did discover a, quote, 7.65 Mauser, bolt action, equipped with a 4/18 scope with a thick leather brownish black sling to it, close quote. One of the members of the Warren Commission, then Congressman Gerald R. Ford of Grand Rapids, Michigan, wrote that the rumor that a German Mauser had been found was based upon a police officer having told a passing reporter that he thought he might have seen a Mauser. That explanation appears to be false, in view of Craig's statement, Weitzman's affidavit, a copy of which I gave to the Warren Commission and to Congressman Ford in 1964, and in the face of newly discovered documents, which we have just secured from the CIA files after having made an application under the newly amended Freedom of Information Act. Roger Craig never saw these documents, but they offer very strong corroboration for his statement. This CIA report, dated November 25, 1963, just 3 days after the assassination, states that the murder weapon was a Mauser. And this CIA report, 3 days later, specifically states that the assertion, which later became the Warren Commission's cornerstone in the case against Oswald, the assertion that the murder weapon was a Mannlicher Carcano, is in error.
Mauser German-made rifle with the sniper scope sights that was found on the German-built Mauser with the sniper scope that was used to kill President Kennedy.
7.65 Mauser, German rifle, familiar to those who served in World War II.
Place. It's a 7.65 Mauser, German-made Army rifle, telescopic sight, and 1 shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells have been found nearby, and apparently they're hooking this as the murder weapon.
Sniper scope, high-powered Mauser
The Dallas
rifle.
Sheriff's Department said the rifle had been found in a staircase on the 5th floor of a building near the scene of the assassination. It was a 7.65 Mauser.
A German Mauser, I believe.
There's another word that a Mauser has been found.
Mauser. Oswald worked in the building where the murder weapon, a German-made Mauser rifle, was
still found in the Mauser with which the assassin was apparently armed.
That afternoon, after Officer Tippit was killed, they took a suspect into custody. And I was thinking about this man getting away from me. Then he leaned back and very disgustedly said, "Everybody will know who I am now." Now, this was not a brag. I know it's been blown up to be a brag in the Warren Commission, but this was not a brag. This was a man that
he was
catch in a
embarrassed
building
about
at
it.
night, you know, after it's locked. This is like somebody who's trying to steal something and you catch him at it.
He was embarrassed about it.
Or disgusted that he had blown his cover or been caught or something. You know, it wasn't a brag. My name appeared in several books that had come out condemning the Warren Commission, so people began to come from all over the country. And they'd come in and ask me if they could talk to me and ask me what happened on that day, and I saw nothing wrong with telling them what I saw and heard. You know, I gave my statement. So the sheriff called me in and asked me what the people wanted that were coming down there. And I told him they just wanted to talk to me about what happened. And he said, "Well, you tell them when they come that you didn't see anything and you didn't hear anything."
Did the interviews keep on after you were fired, or were you continued to be?
No, I tried to get back to a normal way of life. You know, I had a family to support, and I took a job managing a bail bond company. But people weren't coming around so much asking me questions as they were following me. And people I had known for a long time, one in particular, asked me to meet him at a coffee shop at Columbia and Carroll Street. And so he was about an hour late, and I was sitting in my car waiting outside of his place. And these two cars kept circling the block. So we took, finally he arrived and we went over and we had our coffee. We were followed in by this man in a checkered jacket that was driving one of the cars. So by the time we finished our coffee, we started to leave. The man jumped up and he left first. And we walked out and went over to Columbia Street. We were standing on the curb, and all of a sudden my friend fell to the ground. And I thought, well, he stumbled, you know. And for some reason, I stepped off of the curb, and when I did, a shot came from behind and passed over my left ear, and I headed for my car immediately and went home. And,
your friend dropped, in other words, to be out of the line of fire.
Before the shot was fired.
He apparently knew what was going to happen.
That's my conclusion now. I was digging up some information, actually, for Jim Garrison and Penn Jones Jr. of Midlothian. I was digging up some information that they wanted, you know, in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And I parked my car on the side of the street, and I went to get this information. And when I came back and cranked up my car, it blew up. The engine caught fire, the hood came up, the firewall blew out. I had all the fuses blew, and I was burnt in the chest area, and I had pieces of glass and metal in the chest, small pieces. I don't know what they put in it, but...
it's not possible the car itself could have malfunctioned, did it?
Not that much of an explosion, no.
Somebody put a bomb in your car?
Somebody put something in it. This last time we had a case to work in West Texas in the Davis Mountains. And my boss sent me out there. And he called the client, who was on a 3-party line, and told him what flight I was coming into Midland on, where I was going to rent my car, where I would meet him and at what time. So I flew into Midland, I rented the car, and I arrived. I was about 2 miles from where I was supposed to meet the client, a mile or 2 miles from where I was supposed to meet him. I was supposed to meet him at 3 o'clock, and it was 2:55 then. And I rounded a curve, and there were 2 men standing outside of a car that was parked crossways in the road. And there wasn't anything to do but try to go around them, and I tried and I missed, and I went over the edge of the mountain, and I rolled end over end for 90 feet or so. I broke my back in 2 places. I broke my left shoulder. I tore the ulnar nerve and ligaments out of my left elbow, crushed my left foot, my right leg. I spent a year in a hospital, 4 major surgeries, 2 on my back, and I'm now totally disabled in the back, partially disabled in the right leg, and unemployed again.
Roger Craig's life had become one of constant pain, debt, and limbo.
Do you think anyone else is going to come forward and tell it like it was, or as they saw it?
I don't know. I can't speak for anyone else.
Do you think it'll help your situation if someone else does? Or do you think they too would be harassed and put down?
If they knew something really important, one of us would have to go. You can't have corroborating witnesses. It's
there are people who know something very important.
I'm sure they are. Now, Buddy Walters was one of them that knew something very important, but he was shot to death here a couple of years ago. Now, I have 2 friends that were on the bond desk. One of them was still talking to me, and he died of cancer. And then the other one, he died here, I believe, last December of a kidney infection. And then there was another one that was still talking to me. And these were all people with the sheriff's office now. And he died, and I'm not really sure what he died of. I called the sheriff and offered my condolences, you know, and all the sheriff had to say was he had more chain than he could carry, the man that died.
Tell me what Roger Craig feels inside right now. What's he see for tomorrow?
What do I see for tomorrow?
What do you feel inside right now, and what do you see for tomorrow?
When I get up, let me put it this way. When I get up in the morning, I say, this is the tomorrow I worried about yesterday.
Roger Craig died in Dallas, May 15, 1975, of a rifle wound in the chest. He owned 2 pistols. The coroner's verdict? Suicide.
Craig's crucial observation that Oswald feared that his cover might be blown is better understood in the context of newly discovered information. Arrest Pena, a man who worked for the FBI in New Orleans in 1963, has recently said that Oswald also worked for the FBI in New Orleans at that time, and that they were supervised by the same FBI agent, Warren DeBreeze. Pena said that he was afraid to tell that to the Warren Commission because Warren DeBreeze, now the special agent for the FBI in charge of their office in San Juan, Puerto Rico, threatened to kill him if he testified truthfully before the Warren Commission. And William Walter, who was in charge of the New Orleans FBI office from midnight to 8 a.m. during that time frame, recently said that the records which he examined constrained him to conclude that Oswald did work for the FBI in 1963. Oswald was questioned for more than 12 hours by 7 FBI agents during the 48 hours he was permitted to live while in custody. There is no record of what Oswald told the FBI. No tape recording, no stenographic record, and even the few notes jotted down by the FBI agents were destroyed by those FBI agents. All that remains of Oswald's response while in custody are the brief interviews conducted by the news media. Years after Jack Ruby killed Oswald, we learn through this letter, signed by J. Edgar Hoover and suppressed by the Warren Commission for almost a decade, that Ruby also worked for the FBI before he killed Oswald. Who was Oswald? Craig's crucial observation of him on November 22nd in Dealey Plaza and his confrontation with him a little later caused the question to be posed in 1963. More than a decade later, a congressional investigating committee was still troubled by the implications of FBI cover-up. Just recently, in winning a case in the federal district court against the Secret Service under the Freedom of Information Act, we were able to determine that the Secret Service maintained a file in 1963 with the names of 1 million potential threats to presidents. 1 million. On the average, 1 out of every 200 Americans were listed as potential threats. Yet Oswald, an activist for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a man who had renounced his American citizenship in Moscow, who had sought a visa to Cuba and to the Soviet Union, who owned a rifle, and who recently secured a job on the president's motorcade route, was not among the million potential threats. Was that because he worked for the FBI?
What's My Line? Now, let's meet our award-winning What's My Line panel. First, the popular columnist whose voice of Broadway appears in the New York Journal-American and papers coast to coast, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
Dorothy Kilgallen, sharp-witted TV personality and skillful journalist. From the 1930s to the 60s, Kilgallen was one of the most powerful women in print.
Suddenly she was making out with a homosexual all over town.
We'll also uncover how Dorothy's fascination with the JFK assassination put her on a collision course with danger.
She had stumbled across something really big.
And finally, we'll explore the theories behind Kilgallen's unusual undoing.
She did know too much. Her death is very mysterious.
I mean, if they killed the president, they're not going to worry about a Broadway columnist like Dorothy Kilgallen, right?
Lock your doors and pull the shades. This story has conspiracy written all over it. Did the murder of an American president figure in the death of Dorothy Kilgallen? Enter Dorothy Kilgallen, star reporter and columnist for New York's Journal-American. The inquisitive journalist landed a secret interview with Ruby during his incarceration in Dallas. The following March, Kilgallen wrote in her column, "The point in this historic case is that the whole truth has not been told." Biographer Johnny Whiteside.
She was interviewing all sorts of people really deep into the case and running just series after series of stories in the New York Journal-American that were asking a lot of seemingly unanswerable questions.
Doug Mensch is the author of The Big Book of Conspiracies.
The more she found out about the Warren investigation and witnesses being threatened into silence, the more suspicious she became. She started saying, this has to be a conspiracy.
But before Dorothy had a chance to publish her findings, the 52-year-old writer was found dead in her New York City townhouse. How she wound up that way is anyone's guess.
I think it's highly suspicious that Dorothy dies after saying she's going to bust this case wide open and have the scoop of the century, the biggest story of all time.
But we'll get into Kilgallen's puzzling final exit a little later on in the show. First, let's take this story back to the beginning. July 3rd, 1913, the day Dorothy Kilgallen was born in New York City. Oscar-nominated filmmaker Gene Bach was a close friend of Dorothy's.
Mr. Kilgallen was a prominent reporter for the Hearst paper. She was sort of the apple of Mr. Kilgallen's eye, and he was instrumental in getting her first newspaper assignment, which was spectacular.
In 1931, 17-year-old Dorothy dropped out of college to work as a cub reporter for the New York Evening Journal. But it wasn't until 1936 that the ambitious writer catapulted into national stardom. Kilgallen biographer Lee Israel.
Her first big break was her participation in a race around the world in 38 days, and in each of those days Dorothy had her picture. She was in the headlines. So when Dorothy came back, Dorothy was famous.
Kilgallen's friend, music producer Marlon Swing.
She developed her own style and forcefully went into this man's world. There were a few, quote, sob sisters writing columns, but her main reportage was crime and heavy-duty investigation.
In 1938, Dorothy got her own byline, but instead of the crime beat, Kilgallen covered Broadway for the Journal-American.
And then they gave her this column, which started out locally and then became nationwide, called The Voice of Broadway. Mainly it dealt with theatrical people in New York.
Like cabaret entertainer Bobby Short.
She was tremendously powerful. People would kill to be in the column. And newspapers were everything in those days.
Dorothy wrote everything from backstage gossip to royal coronations in her column. In 1940, Kilgallen married a young actor named Dick Colmar. The couple soon hit the radio waves when their daily chat show, Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, premiered in 1945.
They were the original Mr. and Mrs. radio show, and they broadcast from their house in their night clothes.
Syndicated columnist Liz Smith.
She was out every night in New York with her husband, Dick Calmer, and people would listen to Dorothy and Dick out of irritation, I think, more than being charmed by it.
But there was no doubt about Dorothy's charm when she began appearing as a regular panelist on a new TV quiz show called What's My Line in 1950.
What's My Line?
Mr. Steve Allen.
They wanted somebody like a Dorothy Kilgallen because she was kind of acerbic and sarcastic. It was her job on the panel of What's My Line to ask sort of sometimes impertinent questions. She probably guessed what people's line was, what their job was, more often than anyone on the panel.
That makes it 5 down and 5 to go with Kilgallen.
Do you have anything to do with the numbers coming up on the scoreboard every time the Dodgers get a home run?
Actually, I think you hit it right on the head.
When Dorothy was on What's My Line, she played to win the game. On one hand, she was able to make shows, make entertainers, or kill them. And on the other hand, she was this little girl playing games.
But Dorothy Kilgallen was no little girl, and the games she was playing would soon turn deadly. Back in 1954, Kilgallen was living the high life she'd always dreamed of.
In addition to her television appearances on What's My Line in the column, for throwing marvelous parties in New York in the glamour early 50s days. And Jane and I were honored to be invited. As the old saying goes, everybody who was anybody was at her party.
But on November 22nd, Dorothy was shaken from her blues when President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas by alleged lone assassin Lee Harvey Oswald.
Dorothy, like everybody in the nation, was shocked, and it was a terrible national trauma.
Not to mention a very perplexing crime. Early in 1964, the U.S. government appointed a group, the Warren Commission, to investigate the murder. Dorothy, in the meantime, donned her detective cap and began to sniff around.
Alone amongst the mainstream press reporters, Dorothy began harboring suspicions that the so-called open and shut case against Lee Harvey Oswald was not so open and shut.
Dorothy was finding dissident witnesses, deposing them, publishing their testimony. She was going to Dallas. She was threatening to publish finally, and saying it would be the biggest story of her life.
Dorothy somehow obtained the Warren Commission report testimony given by Jack Ruby while he was in prison, while it was still classified top secret.
For you folks who don't remember, Jack Ruby is the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald on national television 2 days after Oswald bumped off the president. Soon, Dorothy's digging caught the attention of more than just her loyal readers.
She had found, I think, several hundred discrepancies in the Warren Commission report. All our phones were tapped because they were trying to figure out how she had gotten that.
She said she was going to blow the JFK assassination case wide open and have the scoop of the century. She was able to obtain the first interview with Jack Ruby in prison and the only interview with Jack Ruby where the reporter was alone with him in an unbugged room, where, in other words, where Ruby felt free to talk.
I know that she could have gotten a lot out of Jack Ruby because she had that technique. She gave hints that something was coming up, that she had stumbled on to something.
She would say, I'm going to New Orleans. I got to meet a man there. It's all very cloak and daggerish.
I wondered a lot about this so-called folder that she had. She brought it into the dressing room at What's My Line and said, here's all the stuff that I've learned, and I'm working on it. Nobody can have a look at it.
In the summer of 1965, Dorothy was suddenly swept off her feet by a shady out-of-towner.
This person I referred to as the new man in her life. His suddenly romancing her and his sudden interest in her was prompted by somebody, not necessarily himself, but prompted by some faction.
In 1965, journalist Dorothy Kilgallen was convinced there was a deliberate plot behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When it came to criminal investigations, Kilgallen's track record was pretty good. She was on target in the Sam Shepard murder case back in 1954, and Dorothy was positive she uncovered evidence to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone in the shooting of JFK.
Through her research and the interview with Jack Ruby and the other witnesses that she had contacted, she was convinced that it was conspiracy.
Kilgallen was racing to finish a book about the assassination titled Murder One. She was also in love again, this time with a mystery man from out of town.
She was involved with this newspaper man from Ohio, and that made her terribly happy.
Gene Bach's husband, Bob Bach, had a couple of cocktails with Dorothy on the night of November 7th, 1965.
I knew she'd had the drinks with Bob. They'd been at Clark's. I think she said, just drop me off at the Regency. So she was having a late date that night.
She was seen again at the Regency Hotel, which was said to have been the trysting place of herself and the out-of-towner. She disappeared into the reddish dark of the Regency Lounge, and that was the last time anybody who would admit to seeing Dorothy saw her that night.
The next morning, the body of Dorothy Kilgallen was discovered in her Upper East Side townhouse. The official cause of death was later determined to be acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication, circumstances undetermined. In other words, she died from too much pills and liquor.
She was found dead in her bed with a book called The Honey Badger by Robert Ruark next to her open. She could not read without her reading glasses, and they were all the way across the room, far out of reach. A number of other people, including the medical examiner and the police detective, have made statements or allegations that the death seemed staged.
And get this, without much poking around, the cops came to the immediate decision that Kilgallen's death was an accident. Dorothy was known to throw back a few drinks. Combine the alcohol with too many sleeping pills, and there you have it, case closed. But a more in-depth look at the facts revealed something interesting.
Dorothy was not a smoker, and the medical examiner's report showed an inordinate amount of nicotine in her.
What disturbs me is that there was absolutely nada investigation of her death at the time. The head of toxicology at the time had a beaker of extract from Dorothy's brain and stomach. It was kept virtually on ice.
13 years after Kilgallen's death, the beaker was still on ice. That is, until biographer Lee Israel did some digging of her own and had the extract analyzed.
Substance from her stomach bespoke the presence of 3 different kinds of slow-acting sleeping pills, which is exactly what you would do, I suppose, if you were a kiss-and-kill kind of guy who was dispatched by the CIA or by whomever.
A kiss-and-kill kind of guy like, say, the mysterious out-of-towner?
If enough people believed that she had the scoop on what really happened, that would probably impel them into some violent actions.
She had notes and notes and notes about it, which after her death disappeared.
The file was supposedly very thick. It was suspected that it was either stolen or her husband had it and may have destroyed it. Her husband, Richard Colmar, the actor-producer, was asked what was in Dorothy's file. He said, "I'm afraid that's a secret that will have to go to the grave with me."
And so it did. Colmar committed suicide in 1971. Nobody ever found out the truth about Dorothy's death or about what Jack Ruby told her in prison. All loose ends in a much bigger plot. Dorothy Kilgallen will probably be remembered as the quizzical pundit on What's My Line? But who knows? If her findings in the JFK assassination were ever published, this might be a different story altogether.
An attractive Washington socialite with ties to JFK is gunned down in the city's exclusive Georgetown neighborhood.
There was a lot of gossip in Washington about Jack Kennedy having various affairs.
I think it was a flirtation, and at some point the flirtation became an actual sexual relationship.
It's a brisk Monday afternoon in October. A stylish, middle-aged woman strolls along one of Georgetown's canal towpaths. Then, from behind, a man grabs and drags her towards the woods. Shots are fired. Within minutes, the woman's dead.
The murdered woman on the towpath is Mary Pinchot Meyer, wealthy and prominent Georgetown socialite and artist.
But what's most shocking is Mary's close and personal relationship to JFK. Her murder will become one of the most controversial and mysterious homicides in Washington history. Moments before the attack, 24-year-old tow truck driver Henry Wiggins arrives on Georgetown's Canal Road. He's responding to a report of a stalled car.
As soon as his truck, I would say within 1 minute, he started to hear the screams of a woman on the canal.
He told police he saw a Negro male dressed in a tan windbreaker, a golf hat, dark slacks and dark shoes, standing over the prone body of a woman.
Convinced he's just witnessed a murder, Wiggins races back to the gang and calls police. Robert Decker of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department responds to the call.
Somewhere around 12:20, we got the call for a shooting. I knew the gas station well. We were there within minutes.
Police rush back to the scene.
They siren down Canal Road to where the Foundry underpass is, and they all three get out of the squad car and run up to the murder scene.
And there I discovered her body lying on the towpath. There was no life, that she was deceased. There was blood on her face, and there was an indication of on the left side of her head that she apparently had been shot. My prime duty then was to protect that scene from anybody coming in and disturbing it.
We know that she struggled because there was strong physical evidence murder scene of her blood all over a tree trunk, to which we can assume that she may have clung in her death struggle. There were 20-foot drag marks in the gravel on the towpath, which indicated that the assailant had attempted to drag her into the woods between the canal and the river.
Police frantic the woods along the canal. They quickly seal off possible exit routes, hoping the killer is still in the area.
There are small bridges that are leading to civilization. They close off the bridge down there, they close off the bridge there, and they begin a search of these grounds.
I feel pretty sure that the towpath was covered You either had to go in the canal, or you had to go down to the wooded brush part, or go up toward Key Bridge and look for an escape up toward Key Bridge. But that was covered.
As officers tighten the net on the killer, Henry Wiggins tells the officers what he witnessed from his view of the towpath.
This Negro male was approximately 5 feet 8 inches in height and weighed about 185 pounds.
As Detective John Warner proceeds down the railroad bed, he sees this young Afro-American man who is soaking wet. He's got twigs on his clothes. He looks a little disoriented. He's got a cut on his hand. Part of his pants is torn. And so Detective Warner decides to interview him.
The man identifies himself as Ray Crump. The police officer asks him what he's doing there, and he says, "I was fishing and I fell asleep and my pole fell in the water and I just woke up."
As a storyteller, David Baldacci sees Ray Crump as a pivotal character.
Raymond Crump Jr. was 25 years old, and the father of 5. He'd been in and out of trouble, though he had no history of violent crime. He fits the description of the suspect, and his story seems shaky.
Detective Warner wonders, why is this man wet? Why was he hiding in the culvert?
Detective Warner asks him a series of questions. Did you hear any gunshots? Did you hear anything funny going on? Are you aware of any other commotion? And Crump says no.
But Ray Crump did have a story to tell, one that would seem improbable to many.
Ray at that time told him that he had been fishing and that he had either fallen asleep and slipped into the river, or that when he awakened, he realized that his fishing gear had slipped and he tried to retrieve it and then he fell in.
There was no evidence of any fishing gear on the rocks on the Potomac, which is where Ray escorted the officer. There was a bottle of whiskey, half drunk. There was a bag of potato chips, but there was no evidence of any fishing gear.
As Detective Warner considers Crump's story, he gazes up the embankment where Detective Bernie Crook and other officers are huddled on the towpath. They're only 500 feet from Mary's body.
At which point, Henry Wiggins peers over the embankment and tells Detective Crook, who's also on the scene of the murder, that it looks like the man he's. Detective Crook goes down the embankment, interviews Crump, and arrests him.
As a police officer, I've got a witness to say that guy has killed this woman, and he's in the vicinity, and I see him. I'm not doing my job if I don't detain this guy. They detained him, questioned him. His story was completely fuzzy. Got an eyewitness. Here come the handcuffs.
But is Crump the murderer? While he's transported to the police station, officers shift their focus to the unidentified victim.
Detective Crook examined Mary's clothing, and on the inside of one of her leather gloves, on her name tag, was the name Meyer etched into the tag itself.
Police search the phone book and find a listing for Mary Meyer. When they arrive at her townhouse, no one's home. But a neighbor suggests they try her sister Tony's house down the street. There they speak with Tony's husband, journalist Ben, who would go on to be executive editor of the Washington Post.
They told me about the fact that somebody had been shot in Georgetown crossing the towpath, and that there was some suggestion that it was Mary. I was asked by the police to come to the morgue and identify her body, and I did.
For police, it appears to be an impressive day's work. In a matter of hours, they've tracked down and arrested a suspect, identified the victim, and notified her family. But the easy part is over.
This was far from an open and shut case, and the prominence of the victim only added to the mystery. Even in Washington high society, Mary Pinchot Meyer stood out. She was an aristocratic person from New York, She was part of the Georgetown Social Club. Everybody of prominence knew Mary Meyer. And on top of that, she had concrete ties to the President of the United States, who had just recently been assassinated.
Coming up, just how close was Mary Meyer to John F. Kennedy? And is Ray Crump too convenient a suspect? The murder of wealthy Georgetown divorcee Mary Pinchot Meyer rocks Washington's social and political elite. At the National Cathedral, mourners gather to pay tribute.
For the rich and powerful and politically well-connected, Washington, D.C. does really great memorial services. They really do.
Mary's friends tearfully recall her beauty and intelligence. She's remembered as fearless and wild.
Her family was aristocratic and wealthy, but they also had a bohemian attitude, and the boys that she dated were from families like that. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Those were the date weekends.
On one of those weekends, Mary met a young man lived in and out of her life, the future president, John F. Kennedy.
JFK, like Mary, was from a very well-to-do family in Boston, not New York. He was a skinny, funny, gawky guy, and she was this beautiful woman, and she was on a date with someone else, and she may have danced with him and flirted.
Mary, I think, liked Jack, but she wasn't all that interested in him as a boyfriend. I mean, I think she kind of looked at him as sort of a wealthy playboy.
If Mary didn't see Meryl in young Kennedy, she apparently saw it in Cord Meyer Jr., the man she eventually married shortly after World War II. Like Mary, Cord was from a wealthy family. A Yale grad with war hero credentials, his political star was rising.
If there was anybody in my generation that I can think of that looked like a promising leader, it was Cord Meyer. He looked to me as if he was going to be the spokesman for my generation.
But any of Cord Meyer's political aspirations took a sharp turn, approached by family friend Allen Dulles to join the CIA. Cord accepted the post, and the couple moved from New York to Washington.
Cord and Mary lived around the corner from where Tony and I lived, and Mary, in fact, had a studio in a garage behind my house, and so we saw a lot of them.
At this point, Cord and Mary began to socialize with a young senator from Boston named John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jackie. That's when John F. Kennedy re-entered Mary's life.
As Mary and Senator Kennedy renew their friendship, Mary's marriage is beginning to fail. She doesn't approve of her husband's work with the CIA.
Cord Meyer was the director of the Covert Action Division of the agency, which was involved in all types of covert operations, including a section that dealt with assassination or elimination of a threat.
After 13 years of marriage, Mary and Cord decide to divorce. Afterwards, Mary stays in Georgetown and reconnects with her bohemian artistic roots.
Most days she would go to her studio and paint for several hours, and along about noon or so, she would take her daily long walk, which by and large took her down to the canal.
2 days shy of her 44th birthday, Mary takes her long walk. By 12:30, she's dead. At home, then Newsweek bureau chief Ben Bradley gets a call from Mary's closest friend, who's in Tokyo. She's just received news of Mary's death.
Ann Truitt was calling to frantically inform Ben Bradley that before she, Ann, left for Japan, Mary had asked her to take care of her diary if anything ever happened to her. And Ann was warning Ben to do this for her. At this point, Bradley was stunned. He didn't know that his sister-in-law had any secrets.
In fact, Mary does have an explosive secret. According to Mary's friends, in the years just before his death, Mary and President Kennedy were having a secret affair.
The affair between JFK and Mary Meyer lasted for a couple of years. At first, it was a friendship or flirtation. And at some point, the flirtation became an actual sexual relationship.
In Georgetown, Mary's sister Toni and brother-in-law Ben Bradley were on a desperate hunt for Mary's secret diary. When they arrive at Mary's house, someone's already there. It's a plot twist as good as any I've ever written.
They're surprised to find the house unlocked, and when Jim Angleton is already there, obviously searching for something. And apparently, according to Bradley, Angleton shuffled his feet a little bit in embarrassment.
Angleton was a close friend of Mary and Cord's. Angleton was a big cheese in the CIA, and I guess was Cord's boss at one point, but was also a really dear old family friend.
James Angleton is one of the most mysterious figures of the Cold War. The legendary chief of counterintelligence for the CIA was said to be the most powerful man in Washington and have more secrets than even J. Edgar Hoover. The fact that he's looking for Mary Myers' diary is frankly astonishing.
The first search of Mary's house was fruitless, and the Bradleys and Angleton left empty-handed. Later in the day, Ben and Toni Bradley went to Mary's little art studio, and they arrived there to find, again, James Angleton picking the lock.
And we asked him what the hell he was doing.
One of his nicknames was the locksmith, and there he was, again sheepishly breaking into their property.
After Angleton leaves, the Bradleys double their efforts. They turn Mary's studio upside down.
They found a little diary. She was painting abstract art with blocks of color, and most of the pages color, but about 10 pages of it had phrases of text that Bradley read and immediately recognized as being references to an affair with the president, the late President JFK.
And tell me about what...
I'm not going to tell you what was in it. It was a painter's book filled with, maybe 5 or 6 written observations that had to do with Kennedy.
The Bradleys are stunned by the revelation of Mary's affair. Convinced that her secrets will be safe with the CIA, they give the diary to James Angleton.
An icon of journalism handed this piece of evidence over to a member of the secret agency. There was going to be a trial of a man for this murder, and this was a piece of evidence, essentially, that he handed over to James Angleton.
So Toni gave the diary to James Angleton.
Yep.
I'm trying to get it as a statement from you.
Yeah, well, I don't want to give it as a statement from me.
In his 1995 memoir, Bradley insists that Mary's affair with Kennedy was a private matter and not related to her murder. I think I could understand why he would want to just take this diary, give it to somebody to make it go away. He didn't want to see it on the front page of newspapers. He didn't want to sully his sister-in-law's memory. You have to wonder, why did the CIA take such an interest in Mary's diary? Did her affair with the president have something to do with her murder? These are questions we can ask. Now, 1964, police don't know any of this.
Without any knowledge of the diary, DC police continued their investigation into Mary's murder. Then, a second eyewitness comes forward. But can he be believed? When Mary Meyer is shot to death in Georgetown, it first appears to be a random act of violence. But if so, why are top officials of the CIA searching frantically for Mary's diary? What dark secrets does it contain about Mary's relationship with President Kennedy?
Among Washington insiders, it was common knowledge Kennedy was a womanizer. There were plenty of rumors about Marilyn Monroe and a string of other lesser-known companions. But those same Washington insiders say that the relationship between the president and Mary Meyer was something special, something that went beyond his other liaisons.
There was a lot of gossip in Washington about Jack Kennedy having various affairs. The press knew about it. but it was a gentleman's agreement to keep it out of the news.
But Mary Meyer was different. We went through the White House gate logs from this period, see her being signed in on at least 15 occasions under her own name, always around dinner time, almost always when Jackie was known to be traveling.
Mary Meyer didn't really need anything from the president. She wasn't social climbing by trying to be with him. She didn't need his money. She had her own independence.
JFK's general counsel, Meyer Feldman, told me that he thought JFK regarded Mary as an equal, in some sense. As much as a man of status and stature and time could allow a woman to be an equal. We do know that he wanted her around him on some pretty tense, historic days. She was the first person that he had in the office with him after Medgar Evers in Mississippi was shot.
I think the President Kennedy really came to appreciate and respect her opinion on a number of matters.
And Mary Meyer was for her strong opinions.
Mary Meyer wanted to have an impact on Kennedy in terms of turning him away from Cold War perspectives toward something much bigger.
The affair between JFK and Mary Meyer lasted for a couple of years. Certainly it was going on in 1962 and well into early 1963. I think Mary might have been trying to influence JFK in the direction of world peace.
You had the world's most powerful man coupled with a beautiful, accomplished, intelligent woman who I think had an agenda for wanting to change that most powerful man's worldviews. And because of that, it makes a great story. Who knows what might have happened? But on that day in November in 1963, everything changed. When President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Mary's dreams of world peace died with him.
Mary reacted to the JFK with shock and horror, like everyone else in the country. But she also had a personal relationship with him, so it was personally painful to her.
In the months after JFK's assassination, Mary has a growing sense she's being watched.
She had the sense, and she told people, that somebody was getting in her house and going through her things.
Mary was kept under observation by the agency, and particularly Jim Angleton's group and security. I had heard that they may have tapped her phones or kept her under surveillance.
Then, less than a year after Kennedy's death, Mary too is gunned down.
It's an incredible story, but you have to stop and remember. The Washington police had no inkling about any of this. They didn't know about Mary's affair with Kennedy, her diary, the CIA's search of her house. Their sole focus was on Ray Crump.
Their theory was that it was an attempted rape. He was a predator. He had picked this woman and she fought back, and he shot her to make her stop screaming.
Within days of the murder, a new eyewitness materializes, seemingly out of nowhere. An Army lieutenant by the name of William Mitchell reads about the case and realizes he was on the canal towpath at the same time. He remembers seeing the victim and the suspect.
Mr. Mitchell was running on the towpath, as he did often, and he said that he passed a black male following Mrs. Meyer on the towpath.
Lieutenant Mitchell's description perfectly matches the verbal sketch given by Henry Wiggins, down to the very last details of Ray's clothing. Police are more confident than ever that they've found Mary's killer.
And certainly there were legitimate questions whether Crump killed Mary Meyer. Today, I think there's a different and more interesting question. Are there reasons to believe Mary's death was something other than a random act of violence? Some say yes.
She was killed by 2 bullets, one in her head, one below her shoulder blade. It was clear from the coroner's report that this was a crime of extraordinary professionalism.
A close review of the evidence from 1964 shows no forensic link between Ray Crump and Mary Meyer. The prosecution's entire case was circumstantial.
There was no hair, there was no fiber, there was no evidence of blood stain of any kind on any of Raymond Crump's clothing.
And these blood stains are very potent. You can jump into water with a blood stain, but it doesn't wash away easily.
Police find no evidence of powder burns on Crump's hands.
Given that we know that Mary Meyer was shot at point-blank range, there would undoubtedly have been powder burns on the fingers and the hands of the person who fired the gun.
So there was no really physical evidence on Mr. Ray after he was arrested.
But why had Ray Crump lied to police about being on the canal towpath fishing? In her 2009 memoir, Dovey Roundtree offers an answer. Crump had been there for a liaison with a married woman named Vivian.
He was absolutely terrified that his wife would find out he had been cheating on her, and Vivian, for her part, was absolutely terrified that her husband would beat her to death if he found that she was cheating on him. And they had gone to the canal, a place where he had fished a number of times, and they had sex and drank. Apparently, Ray drank quite a great deal. After the sexual activity, he fell asleep, he told Dovey, and he slid off the wet rocks into the Potomac River and climbed out and looked for Vivian, who was nowhere to be found.
Dovey Roundtree's investigator located Vivian, and she corroborated every detail of Ray's story, although she never testified in court.
Vivian balked. Vivian was simply terrified and refused to do that, and after that conversation, Vivian disappeared.
Now, once you begin to doubt Ray Crump was Mary Meyer's killer, you open the door to a range of alternate theories. Given Mary's established connection to Kennedy and the fact that James Angleton sought out her diary, conspiracy theorists suspect CIA involvement. And in recent years, some other intriguing questions have also surfaced.
Doubts have been raised about the identity of the second eyewitness, Lieutenant William Mitchell.
By the time of the trial, Mitchell was now saying that he worked full-time at Georgetown University. There was no record of any William L. Mitchell ever having taught there.
Even more intriguing is the home address Mitchell gave the court.
Mitchell's address was actually a known CIA safe house. That is, when certain covert operatives came into Washington for a stint of work or whatever, they were often given cover at this apartment complex. He had a phone number there, he had an apartment number there, but there was no record of him ever being there. It was clear to me that Mr. Mitchell was not who he said he was.
Just the help of investigator Roger Charles to look into Lieutenant Mitchell's military background. Rogers searches Pentagon phone directories of the period.
There was no other record of him anywhere in the Army, and yet he claimed to be, at the time, a lieutenant colonel in the Army and was identified in the court record as a second lieutenant in the Pentagon. He only shows up in the fall of 1964 directory. He's not there in the summer directory of 64. He's not there in the winter directory, 64. So that's fair.
Janney also takes a second look at the story of tow truck driver Henry Wiggins and the report of a disabled car that brought him to the towpath.
After the murder is over, sometime within the next couple of hours or so, the stalled Nash Rambler disappears, and there's no record of anyone ever having fixed it. Henry Wiggins testifies that he never fixed it, but it disappears mysteriously.
Interviewed years after the murder, Wiggins said he'd always had a feeling that he had been called there to be a witness.
The car was placed at the scene in order to bring Wiggins there to be witness to the murder. The murder actually takes place 1 minute or less as soon as they arrive.
To make sense of the idea that the CIA wanted Mary Meyer eliminated, you have to consider the whole web of conspiracy theories surrounding the Kennedy assassination. They range from the interest to the improbable, but the overriding theme is that the CIA and the military-industrial complex were at odds with Kennedy and could not control him. So they orchestrated his assassination. If you buy into that, then it takes just one more line to connect the dot to Mary's murder.
On September 27, 1964, the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President Kennedy names Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin. Just 2 weeks later, Mary Meyer is murdered.
Cord Meyer, close to death, told author David Heyman, when David Heyman asked who he thought had killed his wife, Cord said something to the effect of, the same sons of bitches who killed John Kennedy.
To me, it's very obvious that the CIA was connected with the murder of Mary Meyer.
No, for Christ's sake, no, certainly not. Why would the CIA want to do it? I don't get that. Never mind, I don't get it, and I don't believe it, so.
Do I think that the CIA was capable? Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of things about that time that we don't know still.
Simple murders and atrocities do not constitute the gravamen of the charges in this indictment. Rather, the charge is that of conscious participation in a nationwide government-organized system of cruelty and injustice in violation of every moral and legal principle known to all civilized nations. The tribunal has carefully studied the record and found therein abundant evidence to support, beyond a reasonable doubt, the charges against these defendants. The principle of criminal law in every civilized society has this in common. Any person who sways another to commit murder, any person who furnishes the lethal weapon for the purpose of the crime, any person who is an accessory to the crime is guilty. How easily it can happen. There are those in our own country, too, who today speak of the protection of country, of survival. A decision must be made in the life of every nation at the very moment when the grasp of the enemy is at its throat. Then it seems that the only way to survive is to use the means of the enemy, to rest survival upon what is expedient, to look the other way. Well, the answer to that is survival as what? A country isn't a rock. It's not an extension of oneself. It's what it stands for. It's what it stands for when standing for something is the most difficult. Before the people of the world, let it now be noted that here in our decision, this is what we stand for. Justice, truth, and the value of a single human being.
We have the CIA document after the Kennedy assassination, instructing the media on how to handle it. And they used the phrase conspiracy theory. As far as I know, that's the first time that we have a document that talks about conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
It's CIA telling the newspapers how to attack people like me.
Right. And the basic instructions from the CIA to their media assets was call them conspiracy theorists, and that will have the effect of marginalizing them and take some of the heat off.
Right, exactly. Well, we don't get many of those documents. We get a few. But we have to look around the known world that we see and we read about in the newspapers. And I think actually most Americans have some awareness of this. You know, if they live in a city like Chicago,
sure,
maybe not now, but 50 years ago, the mob was in City Hall. And anybody who had anything to do with City Hall knew that because they had to pay certain people off and so on.
Right.
It's not in the official history of Chicago.
Well, this is interesting because you've done some real investigation on how organized crime is a component of the deep state and has these connections that we don't hear very much about.
That's where I really began with this kind of analysis because I wrote a book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK.
That's an excellent book.
The biggest gap in the Warren report is when they were saying that Ruby was a loner, when Ruby was obviously somebody very clued in with the mob, and that's half of it. Also, very clued in with Dallas high society, and above all, clued in with the Dallas police. And we actually have testimony from Dallas police officers saying they used Jack Ruby as an informant on the drug traffic. And we have somebody else who told the FBI that a big drug deal only went through in Dallas after Jack Ruby gave the okay on it. Now, the Warren Commission received these documents, and then they said he was a loner. Well, that taught me that you have to see more to politics than what's on the record.
Yeah.
And organized crime was where I went in. That led me to the drug traffic. It led me to the CIA. And
yes, and you found that interface between the CIA and organized crime.
Yeah.
In your book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, you outline all of these intelligence connections that Oswald had and how through these connections he was set up to appear in a certain way as a kind of leftist loner, and that this method was actually used in 9/11 also, but there it was applied to 19 people instead of just one.
Yes, I think that I have more than one book where I draw attention to the analogies between Kennedy assassination and 9/11. And this is one of them, that what I call the designated culprits.
Yeah, that's a great
people
term.
Who were already known to the agencies, in the CIA in particular, and in both cases, the CIA was covering up, both on Oswald and on the alleged hijackers, to make sure that they would not be rounded up before the deep events that they are attached to, because then they couldn't have been the designated culprits.
I see. So on a certain level, they're being protected right up to the point where they can be used in a scapegoat role.
Right, and that's a matter of history now with Oswald, but it should be a matter of grave concern, and actually is right now. People campaigning to get those 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Investigation of 9/11 released, because it will show, we pretty well know a good deal of the story by now anyway, but it would be an official documentation of the Saudi money going to these alleged hijackers, the CIA's protection of these hijackers, the lying, saying that they had given money to the information to the FBI when in fact they had refused to give, as they should have given the information to the FBI. All of that would come out. That would be one way, I think, of ending the state of emergency we're in, to see the really corrupt way in which it was instituted in 9/11 in the first place.
Right. So you could almost say that Oswald and the hijackers share this kind of archetype of how to portray someone as an off-balance fanatic, but with no outside connections to any state sponsors or intelligence organizations.
Yeah.
Work. Let's take a snapshot of all the major deep events that have happened, starting with the JFK assassination, bringing us up to the present. What would you say are the 5 most crucial deep events that have happened in American history?
Yes, well, when we come to the Kennedy assassination, what's that got to do with the Doomsday Network? The answer is, well, there are many. It's quite a complex answer, but I'll just single out one salient detail to stand for the rest.
Okay.
And that is that the Secret Service agent who came down from Washington to plan the parade route, which ended up going by the school book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly shot at the president.
Yeah.
That Secret Service agent was using all his communications were on the White House Communications Agency network, which was a branch of the Doomsday Network.
Aha.
And if I could jump fast forward to the 9/11 before I fill in what's in between.
Sure.
That network, I'm sure, was used again on 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission, looking for key decisions that were made, like the implementation of COG, they reported that they could find no record of the phone calls.
Oh.
And in another book I wrote, The Road to 9/11, which I summarize in this book, I made an argument that Cheney, spent right in the middle of all this crisis. He was not in what we call the PEOC, or the Emergency Operations Center underneath the White House. He was somewhere else at a telephone. That was, I'm quite convinced, a Doomsday Network telephone. And the 9/11 Commission report records that, yes, COG was implemented on that day, and then they have a footnote in which they say they did not look into COG. Well, that's like saying they didn't look into the very heart of 9/11.
Exactly.
Because the really key decisions, I think, were made on the COG network, and I don't think they were ever given access to that network. So they tried to cover that up by saying it's okay, we just didn't look into it. Well, they didn't look into it because they couldn't look into it because they didn't have the clearances. All right, now let's go back. After the Kennedy assassination, and this man Winston Lawson, who was this key Secret Service agent, by the way, not the only person. I have a whole article that's complicated.
Yeah.
We come to Watergate, and the key burglar, James McCord, was also part of a secret Air Force unit that was planning for rounding up. I could read you the description if you like. We know what his job was there, and it was he was part of the Doomsday Network.
That's interesting.
And John Dean, who is the man who caused so much trouble for Nixon inside the White House, says in his book, Worse Than Watergate, he mentions that he was in charge of COG planning when he was in the Pentagon before he went to the White House. So
wow.
He actually took part in the COG planning. So you have two key figures, John Dean and James McCord, both part of this Doomsday Network officer.
It is interesting how Bush Sr. shows up over and over again in these deep events. And I guess we need to remember that he was the CIA director in 1976.
Help me, Bush's predecessor.
Director Colby.
Yes, William Colby was fired because he was putting up these intelligence reports.
Right.
And Bush was George H.W. Bush, the father, was put in as head of CIA. And then he created something called Team B, which he brought in a bunch of, these are the advanced neocons.
Yeah.
These are the predecessors of the people who created the project for the New American Century in 2000, which really called for all the things that were implemented after 9/11. And back in '76, they said, no, the CIA's been wrong all along. And the Soviet Union is a major threat, and they're spending a lot of money. In fact, they were spending a lot of money, but it was defensive. America had been spending so much against them.
Yes.
And when the missile crisis had proved that America was on top, and
right.
the Soviets were trying to get parity, and I think the previous team had admitted that. But this got expanded into, no, the Soviet Union wants to take over the universe, certainly take over the globe. And we're still debating this a bit among the Soviet historians, but I think the consensus now is pretty much that the Team B assessment was wildly off base and that the original CIA assessment was closer. But the effects of this were huge, because Carter had been elected on a promise to reduce the defense budget. That would have been, returning to normalcy path. And not only did he not reduce it, because of all these ominous threats from Team B, he expanded it. We talk about the Reagan increases in the defense budget. They became huge under Reagan, but they didn't begin under Reagan. They began under Carter. That again shows you how the president is not really the man who runs the country, and that processes that go on in the deep state, or in this case in the CIA, can determine his agenda in a way which he will not be happy with.
Yes.
It's another example where presidents don't set agendas, and I think that we've seen it with Obama recently.
Oh, yeah.
He made a Middle East speech back in 2009, which was very promising, but almost everything that's happened since then has worked against rather than in the spirit of his original speech. So
definitely.
That's when I say now the deep state is thoroughly ensconced in our government. And as I said, in American War Machine, there's a mindset in Washington, and the president doesn't choose the mindset chooses the president.
Uh-huh.
The regime we're under now, I think.
Well, that really rings true when you look at the state of things now. A couple of things that you have in the book about how the deep state basically hijacked the COG planning, and also FEMA, which is an agency that was originally set up to deal with natural disasters,
yes.
Like floods and earthquakes, for example. So essentially, the deep state figured out if we take over these two government functions, we can implement these authoritarian-style policies through them. Now, is that a fair statement?
My problem with what you just said, you're in the ballpark.
Okay, good.
My problem is I do not posit that there has been a secret conspiracy to take over the government.
All right.
I think there are processes always going on. I was 4 years in the Canadian government, and I spent 6 months in Washington in 1987 trying to help Senator Kerry investigate Contras and drug trafficking.
And that is a very good investigative report that Kerry put together.
Yes.
Going back to it now, it seems pretty advanced.
What goes on in government, particularly American government, which is so huge, nobody really controls it. I do think that people at certain moments made some key decisions. I think, I can't prove this, but I think there was a high-level decision that who made it, I don't know, but that Kennedy had to go. And I think it was a high-level decision that Nixon had to go. And it was a high-level decision that Carter had to go. But they were always ad hoc things, not like this is step one in establishing the deep state. It was just, no, the president has to go. But once these processes are in motion, then they acquire their own logic. For example, if the governing media of this country commit themselves to the position that the president was killed by a lone nut with no connections to anything, even though he had extensive CIA files and BI files.
Oh, yeah.
Then they're committed to lying for eternity, really.
Yes.
You know, for them to tell the truth about the Kennedy assassination would mean to have to say we participated in a lie for the public good, but nonetheless a lie.
Uh-huh.
So that's just an example of what I mean about processes acquiring their own logic. And I think it's not been a single group. You know, when I talk about how the COG Doomsday Network has been involved, that's not always the same people. You get overlaps. There are overlaps between people in the Kennedy assassination and people in Watergate. In fact, I'd already written a manuscript about the Kennedy assassination before Watergate, and in it I had mentioned a man called Frank Fiorini, who under a different name turned up on the front page of the New York Times as one of the Watergate burglars.
Interesting. And this is Frank Sturgis.
Yes, This was Frank Fiorini. And there are examples over and over and over, but there is, I think, no example of somebody involved both in the Kennedy assassination and also in 9/11. No, these are processes.
Uh-huh.
The instruments are there, the machinery is there, the personnel keep changing. But yeah, I think Cheney and Rumsfeld were part of the 1976. Well, no, that's why I wrote that chapter. They were definitely part of this transition in 1976 because it really happened when Donald Rumsfeld was chief of staff under Ford in the White House, and Cheney was his number one assistant. So they've been around from 1976 right through the COG planning, right down to the implementation on 9/11 and the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War.
So they're key players in this sense because they were in the Ford administration during that crucial transition.
Right.
Then they were key to setting up COG in and out of government.
Right.
And then Cheney shows up as defense secretary under Bush 1 versus Saddam in Desert Storm.
Right.
So we have all that, and then later they show up in the Project for a New American Century, running ads that say, you know, we need a new catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, to get people to support their vision of America.
Yes.
And America's role in the world.
Publicly for what they were planning privately.
Yes, exactly.
There's that link between PNAC and the COG planning. And there was a kind of plan brought up when Cheney was Secretary of Defense in 1992. And the deep state has many factions in it.
Okay.
Somebody thought this was too extreme and leaked it to the New York Times. And so it didn't happen in 1992. It had to wait until George W. Bush after 2001. There's one other thing about Cheney. When there was frequently we have these deep events and then we get a commission or we get an investigation. In the case of IRAN-CONTRA, there was a joint special committee of Congress that, quote, investigated, close quote, Iran-Contra. And it was, from my point of view, largely a whitewash because they didn't really get into the drug aspect of it, which was huge. And Cheney was the senior Republican congressman on the House side of that. And he produced a minority report at the time, which essentially said Reagan was right to do all these things, and all he violated were these post-Watergate reforms, which were terrible. We should never have had them. And that has always been, Cheney is of the two. Cheney was the intellectual, if you like, the theorist.
Okay.
And who frequently, he was on a plane with a bunch of journalists, and he took time out to say how wrong Congress had been to try and establish limits and congressional restraints on the CIA. And so that, yes, he has been a theorist, But this is not all attributable to one man or two men or 10 men.
I see, yeah.
Process, the deep state interferes with the public state.
Well, it's very interesting that one of the key mechanisms that the deep state likes to use to intrude on the public state is CIA operations.
First of all, one thing we have to realize is that the connections, the CIA is connected in one direction with Congress and government, but it's connected in another direction with Wall Street and big oil and other major U.S. international corporations. And the history of the CIA really begins on Wall Street with Allen Dulles when he is a lawyer drawing up a kind of charter which then goes to Washington and becomes the National Security Act. So Truman originally did not want a CIA, and when Donovan had a plan to perpetuate the OSS that was the wartime predecessor of the CIA, Truman threw it out. And eventually he accepted a CIA, but he was very careful. The CIA was full of Wall Street people at the vice director level, but the head of it, Truman never chose someone from Wall Street. He always chose someone from mid-America in the western states where he himself was from. And then after Kennedy was assassinated, Truman made a very important intervention which was immediately challenged in the media, but I think he spoke truth. He said, like 2 weeks after the Kennedy assassination, said, when I set up the CIA, I never intended them to get into these covert operations.
Right.
I think history will bear him out on that.
Well, let's take a look now at how the CIA got into the business of covert operations. You know, we have the National Security Act that creates the CIA in 1947. So where's the first major covert action that sets the tone for all of these secret projects to come?
The very first covert operation was in 1948 when they put money into the Italian election to help defeat the Communist Party. Well, that was a Wall Street operation, which then the CIA took over at the insistence of Allen Dulles, who was still a lawyer on Wall Street.
Wow. So Dulles at the time didn't even have an official government position yet.
Right. And then they said, well, we're going to do this sort of thing. Well, we have to set up something. But they didn't set it up in the CIA. They set up something called the Office of Policy Coordination, which is, just a meaningless words.
Yeah.
And that became it immediately had a much bigger budget than the CIA, and it did a lot of really dangerous things, some of which have still never really been properly recorded, like fighting a civil war in the Ukraine, which is coming back to haunt us now in 2015 because it's at the source of the tremendous hatreds inside the Ukraine today. And they got into tension with the CIA, and the result was they said we have to get the OPC under control, and so they merged it into the CIA. And the effect of that was that it wasn't a case of the CIA taking over OPC. It was much more the opposite, that OPC came in underneath and then took over the CIA, and the CIA has been dominated by its operations officers ever since.
So could we say that the OPC was basically the covert arm of the CIA, and then at a certain point it gets the upper hand on the entire agency?
Yes, but the CIA had a hand in controlling the OPC at the beginning, but so did the Defense Department, so did the State Department.
I see. So the OPC were really on the loose, setting up their own actions, and the CIA basically tried to get a handle on them by merging them into the agency. But it sounds like it backfired in a sense.
The CIA did not control OPC in that era, and the same head of CIA, General Beadle Smith, was adamant in calling for getting the OPC under control. It came under control into the CIA just as Eisenhower was elected president, and that meant that Allen Dulles came in as the new head of the CIA and was immediately started planning major covert operations like the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, which was a favor to the oil companies, and also the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala 1 year later in '54, which was a favor to United Fruit and International Railways and the Schroeder Brothers, but Schroeder Brothers were also the bankers for Anglo-Iranian oil, so you were benefiting the same people in the deep state. Allen Dulles was the beginning of the era of major covert operations. Truman was asked to authorize the overthrow of Mossadegh, and he refused and said he sent Harriman to Tehran to work out a deal. And Harriman proposed what I think was the sensible deal, which was that Anglo-Iranian should split its profits with the Iranian government, and Mossadegh accepted, and Anglo-Iranian refused, because even though that's what was happening with in Saudi Arabia with Aramco and the Saudi government, the British were too stiff-necked. They didn't want to see maybe too dependent, actually, because they were pretty poor at that time. Anyway, they didn't accept it. But the important thing is that Truman is right. He didn't authorize that kind of operation. He never did.
Interesting.
It had to wait until Dulles became the DCI for those things to be the trademark of CIA.
Well, when you think about Eisenhower, who worked with Dulles and the CIA in that period, with some major intel actions going on, like Guatemala and Iran, do you think he came to see the threat of all this covert activity? Because, of course, at the end of his term, he gave a public address on television with a farewell warning about the military-industrial complex. And if we go back and watch that, you can't really find another speech with a president warning about the military the way he did.
It's interesting the way he wrote it. He didn't use his regular speech writers. It was done, it was almost a plot against the deep state to get that speech into the record. Just as the same thing with President Kennedy, he made the speech which may have led to his murder. In June of '63, the American University speech where he said, "We are all mortal," and really called for an end to the Cold War. And he, too, had to, in a very secret way, get that speech into the record. Eisenhower was leaving anyway, and Kennedy was, of course, killed 5 months later. But Eisenhower was, I think, never a hawk. I mean, these things happened under his presidency, but I think he delegated covert operations to his vice president, a young politician called Richard Nixon, and was not very interested in what happened. A couple of key decisions came up to him, and one was to back the French at Dien Bien Phu and use atomic weapons. And the calls for this were coming from within his apparatus, and he was an experienced warrior, and he knew the horrors of war.
Right.
And I think his basic thrust was to keep big wars out of the picture. And the downside of that was he wasn't very interested in small-time covert operations, small from his point of view,
right,
overthrowing the prime minister, the elected prime minister of Iran, or the elected prime minister of Guatemala. That was just something he didn't get involved in. The key commitments that got us into war in Indochina, they, again, began under Eisenhower, but I don't think he was aware of them. In fact, key decisions were made on days when the first key decision was made when he was on a golf course in Scotland playing golf as part of a so why did a decision have to be made on that particular day? because Richard Nixon could make it when Eisenhower wasn't. This is not the only case of that happening.
So they were using the president basically as a figurehead and leaving him out of the loop on these key decisions.
Right.
But here's what I think is interesting about this era of the deep state. We have Eisenhower warning about these forces in his speech. Then you have Truman denouncing the CIA that he set up after Kennedy is assassinated.
Right.
And Truman says, I didn't create the CIA to be this out-of-control agency. And then you have President Kennedy, who said he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. So all of these presidents who work closely with intelligence are saying that this covert influence in CIA is a threat to American freedom, basically.
Carter said that it was his policy to reduce the size and strength of the CIA, and Turner did it mostly by taking early resignations and so on. But there were people in the agency who felt targeted by him, rightly so. And I mentioned Shackley before. I'll mention him again. And Theodore Shackley, he was, let's say he was eased out. He wasn't exactly fired, but he was made uncomfortable. He left, and he immediately joined up with the people who were working in the Safari Club to conduct offshore operations that didn't have to go to Congress for approval.
I see.
So, yes, and Carter is another victim, too. Yes.
Okay, so Carter also knew they were dangerous. Well, what's fascinating is this. It looks like the deep state relied on the CIA. Then, when the CIA got into trouble in the 1970s, being investigated over and over again for these unsanctioned operations, then it sounds like the Safari Club became where the focus of the deep state went, as far as intelligence is concerned, anyway. So you were saying it was almost like a government in waiting, because there were these ex-CIA figures kind of biding their time and making deals, making arrangements, waiting for that chance to get back in power and to utilize that public state for their covert planning again. Does that sound correct?
Yes, pretty much. And I want to add to it something which is not mentioned enough in my book, and this again involves Shackley, that because Congress in the 70s established congressional control over the CIA, then the military started getting involved in covert operations, and they set up something called the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC.
JSOC.
And Shackley had a hand in that. And another man called General Stilwell, who had been fired as a result of this flap back in 1952. He was fired by Beadle Smith for his involvement in Thailand.
Okay.
Went over to the military, and one of his last actions was to be an advisor in the setting up of JSOC. And what's going on now is a lot of U.S. covert operations, and not some of them not really so very covert, like the drone attacks, which was,
yes.
I mean, the planning is secret, but people, if there's a drone attack, it's not a secret. And the more and more these things are being handled under SOCOM, Special Operations Command, the Joint Special, JSOC, the Joint Special. There's a whole new bunch of initials in the Pentagon to deal with this kind of warfare, which is a kind of byproduct of Congress establishing oversight over the CIA.
Okay, so I think we've tracked the deep state now to the point where Carter loses re-election in 1980. Due in part to the shenanigans around the October surprise. So then when you get into the Reagan era, and you've touched on Oliver North already, but some interesting things are happening in the Reagan era. Suddenly drug traffic explodes. There are major reports implicating the CIA in drug running. So people with connections to the deep state are firmly back in power. So we have the Contras in Nicaragua running drugs. We have Barry Seal and his ties to the drug operations in Mena, Arkansas, and the Reagan administration. Now, I know you've done some amazing research on this, and so let's get into that, because I want to show how the drugs are related, financing-wise, to the deep state.
Well, yes, I don't say enough about that in this book because I had said a lot about it in my last book.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that the dollar was under severe attack in the 70s and early 80s because of these oil price hikes.
Uh-huh.
So when Reagan was elected president, interest rates were at 17%. The economy was in a terrible mess. And the Treasury started selling bearer bonds, which meant anybody could come in for cash, buy a Treasury bond. Well, this became the number one form of laundering of drug money. And the Treasury was advised at the time, this is going to result in the laundering of drug money. They wanted the drug money. They needed an influx of capital to help bring down the interest rates and get business back to normal. And after about 6 or 7 years, they then stopped issuing bearer bonds. But the atmosphere of drugs in the U.S. economy in early 1980s isn't just the CIA. The CIA use it, they don't get the money themselves, but they work with people who finance their own private armies with drugs. And that was the case with the Contras.
Right. So they could say that basically we're getting better intelligence this way. We have to work with these kind of lower elements in these lawless places.
Right.
And that is the public explanation for what they're doing, basically.
And if it's a lawless place where you happen to be against the government, like in Nicaragua, then you work with the leading opposition, which is usually the local drug traffickers. And that was Bermudez and people who were the head of the Contras. Well, there were different Contra factions, and there was a drug connection to every faction because that was one of the ways of financing the Contras. And before that, the largest army that the CIA ever backed was the Hmong back in the 1970s in Laos. And the CIA even gave them their own airline to help it was to get the arms in, yes, but what did those planes go out with? The single Hmong agricultural product was opium, and this airline flew it out.
Oh, right.
So it was being established going right back to what I was talking about in the early 50s in Operation Paper. Mm-hmm. You bring arms in, and the planes bring the drugs out, and you can say we don't have anything to do with the drugs because in the case of Operation Paper, those planes, which later were known as Air America planes, were actually 60% owned in Taiwan. So you could say, no, that's a Taiwan flight coming out. It's a CIA flight going in.
Right.
The CIA was running the airline.
Well, you have a very interesting corollary between the drug traffic around the Vietnam War and then Afghanistan, which is the new drug war. And to a certain extent, both of these conflicts were drug wars.
Exactly. I would say that I do say in my book, one of my books, it's a rerun of Laos.
Okay.
Yes, and we get a lot in the papers about how the Taliban are financing themselves by drugs, and they are. But everybody in Afghanistan, and certainly the established government, that is the major part of the Afghan economy, just as before it was the major part of the Laotian economy. And the head of the Laotian army was also the head of the Laotian drug agency, but drugs were actually legal. The only difference is that drugs until 1971 were legal in Laos, whereas from the beginning they were illegal in Afghanistan, but that, of course, is good for prices. That helps prices go up. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of the most interesting details that you point out, actually, is that under Taliban rule in Afghanistan, drug production had gone way down, which is amazing.
Virtually eliminated. Yes, in 1 year, bang.
Wow.
There was some drug production, but it all came from the areas which were never controlled by the Taliban up in the north. The northeast was the drug producing area in that period. And that was those people, the people became our allies against the Taliban.
So we're basically allying ourselves with the drug cartel in Afghanistan versus the Taliban.
As we did. Yes, exactly.
Right, that's fascinating. And after we got into Afghanistan, of course, suddenly the drug production level is off the charts again.
Yes, and is again now. It's huge. I don't have the figures for this year, but it went. It more than doubled from the highest year before Karzai went in. And initially, you could almost say there was a humanitarian justification for it because the country was so wrecked by 10 years of civil war that if people had not been able to grow drugs, they would have starved.
Okay.
So maybe for a year or two, you can justify allowing the drug traffic.
I see.
We've been there for over a decade, and we're going to leave the country the number one heroin producer in the world, which it wasn't before the CIA became involved in it. It's very interesting, though. When we were involved in in Southeast Asia, that was the number one opium area producing in the world. And when Nixon recognized China and cut his connections with Taiwan, and then the drug production there plummeted. At the same time, it started rising in Afghanistan. And actually, the levels, or total levels, are not all that different. I believe that there are very powerful drug forces in the world, that the CIA, they don't control these forces, but they are working with these forces. And what's interesting is that first of all, the drugs started going up in Afghanistan, and there, sooner or later, sure enough, the CIA turned up for the first time in a big way in Afghanistan. Now, Brzezinski was the advisor to Carter who authorized operations, which he himself said may lead to a Russian intervention in the Civil War. I don't know that Brzezinski knew anything about the drugs, but I think that in the deep state there are forces that saw this whole thing coming and were able, in other words, eliminating the drugs in Southeast Asia didn't have the effect of eliminating the drug traffic, it had the effect of moving it. And the same thing has happened with cocaine in Latin America. You know, George H.W. Bush proclaimed a war on drugs in Latin America, specifically in Colombia. And I predicted in 1990, I said, if we start this war, I predict that we will have more cocaine and not less. And within 10 years, my prediction was borne out. The cocaine production trebled in Colombia. You want it to go down? End the drug war. But they don't want to end the drug war because it is part of the establishment of how America has a presence in the rest of the world. And yes, we need, one of my chapters is America must end its self-generating wars. Drug war is a self-generating war because you're driving profits up and more people come in. And the war on terrorism is a self-generating war because you create 10 terrorists for everyone that you murder with a drone attack.
Yes, absolutely.
What are called the mainstream media and I call the governing media are media that work very closely with the CIA, and hardly a day goes by when you don't see a story from Washington that says a high-level official who declined to be identified said. That's the CIA putting stuff into the media.
Okay.
And the media, if you want to be an important newspaper, you depend on that connection. And the CIA does favors for the media by giving them stories that the media then think, and the media defends the CIA consistently. I mean, no, I say consistent, not 100% of the time, but yes, I would say consistently most of the time. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I could name names, and that's their job. You know, they work for a newspaper that is part of a control system. And I think I have a small apology in my book where I say I haven't dealt with all of the aspects of the deep state because I wanted very much to look at corporations and the intervening with the level of the public state and the level of the CIA and the NSA. Up at the very top, you have the corporations and the banks. And in between those are these consulting firms like Booz Allen Hamilton, which are full of people who come from the CIA and go back to the CIA or go back to industry, come from industry. They're all interacting.
And this is private intelligence contracting agencies.
Yes, I call them, we have private military corporations, we have private intelligence corporations. Anyway, I don't say enough about the media because that was going in a slightly different direction, but they are part of the deep state and they have their own, Ben McDickian and people who have written about how the corporatization of the media, that it all focuses in the end on Wall Street, and people who are on the boards of the media are on the boards of the big corporations and the banks, and that is the deep state. The media are as much part of the deep state as, say, Booz Allen Hamilton is part of the deep state.
Yeah, well, you have these major media companies and TV stations in New York, along with the national newspapers there.
Right.
And we have Wall Street right in the middle of all that. And you're saying they intertwine very closely and are really part of the same mindset.
Yeah, well, I have to be careful. I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying to myself.
Oh, yeah.
You have to be very careful when you talk about the mindset because you often see conflicts. I mean, Rupert Murdoch and News Corp and Fox News, they're on a slightly different path from, say, the New York Times and CBS News.
Right.
And when Rupert Murdoch's family got into some big trouble in England over crimes, the New York Times did a lot to expose that. So there isn't exactly a single mindset uniting Rupert Murdoch with the New York Times. But if somebody's coming from outside and challenging the whole thing, like a Gary Webb on drugs, then they will unite to deal with him. No, they don't necessarily unite, and I think sometimes seriously disagree on should Iran, for example. I think you do find some serious differences. The PNAC view on what to do in Iran is not, I think, the New York Times view of what to do on Iran. And this is a very complex and interesting area which I may have to write a second book about or something.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you do, because I think it's important to see that the media doesn't tell us the truth. Too many people take it for granted that they will. But even when the media is reporting and following up on an important story, we're not getting the whole truth. They're not really showing us the deeper levels.
Doing it worse, I think somewhere I compare the media performance in the Iraq War with the media performance in the Vietnam War. The media, is from basically people rather like me. I mean, all my life I've known journalists, and they're usually rather decent people. But like bureaucrats, anyone who works for an organization learns either to think the way the organization thinks or to get out. That's why I got out of government. I was beginning to think like a bureaucrat, and I could see myself beginning to think as a bureaucrat, and I left. But
well, I think there's no question that there's a real danger of being absorbed.
Some very good friends stayed in, and they continue to be my good friends, even though they held to views which I now radically disagreed with. Journalists are in that situation, and many good journalists have had to leave. One of the results is that there's now a spectrum between the governing media and people like me. There are a lot of intermediate figures like Robert Parry, for example, who broke the story on Contras and drugs And he broke a number of other stories, and people who were breaking stories back in that era were eased out of the media. And he now has something called Consortium News, which is an excellent self-supporting news agency. He doesn't agree with me about 9/11. He's blasting people who say that there's a conspiracy behind 9/11. But so he's in an intermediate position.
I see.
I'm very glad he's there, and he's been very good on the Ukraine and on U.S.-Russian relations. And
well, it's interesting. And this reminds me of someone like Bill Moyers, who plays a very dual role, because you could say Bill Moyers on one side of things was an insider, a special assistant to LBJ, and had a deep connection and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But he also did some incredible work as a journalist, exposing a lot of political corruption in a special documentary. And this is quite a while ago now, but it was called The Secret Government.
I was supposed to be a major source for that movie. The producers told me 1 week before that I was going to have a big role in that movie. And when I watched it, there were the things I had said, but somebody else said, because the deep state is not a structure. It's not something solid like an iceberg at the end. And I distinguish between structures. Now, the CIA is a structure. The Congress is a structure. But when you're talking about Wall Street, it's not a structure in the same sense. And so I talk there about a system, a solar system, or even better, a weather system.
A weather system, yeah.
A weather system is something you can't precisely say where it stops and where it ends, but it can be very forceful. And you can have a Hurricane Sandy and it can be devastating.
Right.
So I think we're dealing with forces that are not all structured and are not predictable. They interact in different ways.
I see. That's very interesting. Well, in your new book, you talk about how over time it has come down to two different worldviews, really, with two competing mentalities. And so on one side, we have a kind of bottom-up democracy versus a top-down empire.
Right.
Now, can we talk a little bit about that? Because it seems to me to be the foundation of the book, really, the clash of these two intense forces.
Yes, well, that's a thought that I took from Hannah Arendt. And actually, to be really honest, I took it from a man called Jonathan Schell, who adapted Hannah Arendt's ideas into a powerful defense of nonviolence and the vision that the bottom-up powers, the powers of persuasion as opposed to the powers of coercion, are growing. And in my last chapter, I come back to that theme and say that I believe many of my friends here in Berkeley, the left coast,
yes,
they're very depressed about America. And I'm not nearly, I'm a Canadian, first of all. I don't take heart. I don't get as depressed as Americans do when things go wrong in this country because, yes, I'm involved and I care deeply, but I'm also, part of me sees it a bit from outside. And looking from outside, I see that America has had this kind of crisis before. We really are in a period of mania, insanity right now. America's gone crazy about terrorism and is responding in ways which are increasing the terrorism. And some people are very happy to do that because it's intensely profitable to some people. But America's been in periods of mania before and has rectified itself.
Yes. Well, what are some of the self-perpetuating factors that are keeping America in this off-balance state?
We have a very small percentage who are profiting at obscene rates from what's going on right now. And we have many people say we have a new Gilded Age, referring to the late 19th century. But America took care of that. It took a Republican president.
Right.
And after starting with Theodore Roosevelt, income disparity and wealth disparity in this country began diminishing and diminishing and diminishing, and that was true right up until 1980 and the Reagan Revolution, when it started going back very radically in the opposite direction. Well, I believe that the long-term process of history, and this is sharing my idea from Jonathan Schell, that in the long run, the forces of persuasion are increasing. They were nothing to begin with. History for a long time was not a history of persuasion. It was a history of coercion.
True.
But we've had events in American history recently. One of them was the anti-war movement that essentially, from below, helped, not by itself, of course, but helped persuade America to get out of Vietnam. A much more inspiring example was the Civil Rights Movement.
Yes.
Essentially, it was a movement of persuasion. It persuaded whites in the South that they did not want, that it was not in their interest to perpetuate Jim Crow and the prevention of Negroes from voting. It was in their interest to be part of the world as a whole, which disapproved so radically of that situation.
Right.
So, yes, in the end, anyway, that's my last chapter, that the long trend in history is persuasion dominating, whereas in the short term, it's usually coercion dominating, and right now it is coercion dominating. But that is self-defeating, I think, not permanent.
I see. It's their short-term solution, but you see historically.
Term, but is short term. Yes, shorter than the other.
Right. So you're saying historically, America has a chance to turn things around.
America is not, I hear some people saying America's a fascist country. No, it's full of people. I mean, in a fascist country, you and I wouldn't be talking on TV.
That's true. And it's important that we are very specific when we use terms like that. I agree 100%. But on the other hand, we are talking about trends here, like the militarization of the police that you referenced earlier, and the privacy violations we see happening in contracting agencies for intelligence. So what do you see are some of the biggest dangers going on, in addition to what we've covered here so far?
Well, I think it's the accumulation of wealth in the hands of very few people. And so that, particularly since the Supreme Court decision, where money now can turn up anywhere, and that in the short run, I think we will see this Keystone Pipeline, which is a disaster from an environmental point of view. So the money problem is so acute that you might say that's a difference between now and the Theodore Roosevelt era, that America was able to right itself because there wasn't money concentrated in, say, 100 people or something like that. I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true or not, but that the richest people in the country all know each other or are in touch with each other. And if that's true, they can throw their money, but even so, we're still seeing divisions. I mean, one of the largest fortunes squandered in the last election was somebody who was spending his own private money, about 60 million of it, to support candidates who were willing to speak truth to power on the question of global warming.
Yeah.
And in the short run, he lost. But he didn't really lose all that money. It was a step in a process that someday, I mean, either we're going to get smart about global warming, or it's the end. It's not. The culture we're in now is not maintainable unless it can readjust its relationship to the forces of nature.
So I can see from what you're saying that you do have a kind of central optimism for America. And after all, the book is called American Deep State. So you're speaking specifically about America in there.
Yes.
But the trends that you're seeing in America, like you said before, we're in a kind of mania now.
Right.
And, it's almost like McCarthyism or other stressful periods where the official structure just overreached. And, another example would be the anti-war movement.
Yes, or at 1919 in the Palmer raids, which was the blot on U.S. history, but it ended up with Hoover being told not to do that sort of thing. And
right.
Well, I mean, it's a complex story again, but yes, there are things. The short term, reading the paper from day to day, one is rationally, I think, compelled to be a pessimist.
Okay.
But reading American history in the long run, there's room for hope, not so much for a rational prediction that things will go well, but there's room for a hope that they will go well, a room for faith that America is a much better country than the present government we now have, Democrat or Republican, and room to love this country, which I do. I mean, I'm here by choice. I love it. And unfortunately, they've never deported me. So I see so much advantage here that we are all, I think, very fortunate to be in this country, which gives us the opportunity to try and change this country. And that's the whole idea of what America is, a project, a way to make the city on the hill come into being. Anyone who says we are the city on the hill is a liar. But that we have the chance to become it. Yes, I think America, I say in one place that I'm an exceptionalist as a Canadian. I see America as being exceptionalist. I think it was exceptional when it created the Constitution, which was a beam of light to Europe and other parts of the world. And we're exceptional now in the number of prisoners we have in our jails.
Yeah.
And the number of people below the poverty line. I mean, it's a bad moment in otherwise generally noble, if imperfect, history.
Definitely. I can appreciate that. There's no question that greatness lies in our power if we can start to take control of these institutions that really need to be answerable to people, and also expose these deep state forces that are usurping the public interest.
Right.
Well, Professor, moving into our final segment, and it's just extraordinary what you've shared here today, I noticed that you started the American Deep State book with a fantastic quote by Frank Church.
Yes.
Now, of course, Church was the senator from Idaho who challenged the intelligence services and formed the Church Committee to look into their activities in the 70s. I was curious why you chose him and this particular powerful quote. So let's play the quote first, and then when we come back, you can tell me why you chose it.
Yeah.
I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America, and we must see to it that this agency, the National Security Agency, and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That is the abyss from which there is no return.
Well, when I come back to deal with Church in the body of the book, it's in a context of what I see was a very important period in American history between 1960 and 1980, or more narrowly between the Kennedy assassination and the successful efforts of ex-CIA agents to prevent the re-election of Jimmy Carter. Frank Church represented a kind of threat to the deep state at that time, because America was in chaos, really chaos, as a result of the Vietnam War, student protests, black riots in the ghettos. And then we had Watergate, and in the shambles after Watergate, it was unclear what direction America would go in. After the Vietnam War, would we reduce the defense budget and go back to the kind of civilian economy we had before? Or would we alternatively move to an extended military economy and just offshore the manufacturing that used to be done domestically? And you could say that Frank Church represented the best hopes in Congress to go in the direction by exposing things that, when I say the deep state, I mean, of course, the CIA, the FBI. he never, I think, wrote very much about the NSA, but he did look at it, and he was very alarmed by what he saw. And Congress, he brought in legislation to Congress, some of which is very relevant now, like the National Emergencies Act, which said if the president proclaims an emergency, Congress has to review it within 6 months. Well, after 9/11, the president did proclaim an emergency, and that was 14 years ago, and Congress has never renewed it.
Right.
Anyway, Church saw the problems, and he offered a solution. And I sincerely believe that if Carter had been reelected, there was a good chance that there would have been more legislation. But that didn't happen because elements of the deep state, and specifically in my book, I named the oil companies together with the so-called October surprise counterplot of the Republicans, which involved not just ex-CIA agents, but also people from Israel and from Iran. So what happened at the end of those 2 decades is that the deep state, having been challenged by Church and others, emerged actually because there was a struggle at that time, and essentially the deep state won the struggle. So starting with the Reagan Revolution, it's a thesis of my book that the deep state has been in much more powerful position than before. And if we're talking something like the Kennedy assassination, that was a deep state act against the public state. But since the Reagan Revolution, the deep state has been so ensconced in the public state that you haven't seen those kind of tensions between them that we saw so vividly between 1960 and 1980.
Yes, and that's very compelling. One of the things you point out is that the presidency itself got into major problems when the deep state got the upper hand after the JFK assassination, and that the presidency didn't really regain its footing until Reagan was elected in 1980, and the deep state was finally at peace to have Reagan in there.
Exactly. I mean, if we look at the fates of presidents, Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson was going to run for a second term, and then he's having so much trouble with the military that he didn't. Nixon was elected for 2 terms, but he had to resign, and that was, I believe, Watergate has never yet been fully understood, that it was essentially a right-wing plot against Nixon preparing for the Reagan Revolution. And then you had Carter, and he was, I forgot about Ford.
Ford, yeah.
He was defeated. An incumbent president was defeated, the first one since Hoover in 1932, and Carter became the second incumbent to be defeated. So it was a bad time, for the presidency and for the country. I mean, it wasn't all the deep state. There were problems. I mean, losing a war is a traumatic event. I mean, in France, it was the end of the Fourth Republic. So we didn't have anything quite as violent as that. But we had cultural shocks from all of the confusion at that time, which have changed the country, and some of those changes weren't fully implemented until 9/11. But we are now in a different country from where we were in the 50s.
Well, it's definitely true, and I think the direction we're heading in now is not too promising, not currently anyway. Finally, Professor, I was hoping to have you share this very interesting personal anecdote of a strange incident that happened to you and Alfred McCoy, also a great author.
Yes.
And so I believe this takes place in the 70s, and someone had called you and informed you that they had something very special, some special information they wanted to share with you.
Actually, I called them.
Okay.
Yes, this is the opening of the American War Machine. Yes, it is a personal anecdote, and it's a deep event, but a very small one.
Right.
Al McCoy and I both came out with books mentioning the CIA and the drug traffic in 1972. And my book was a book that you could not find in bookstores, and his book became very much thing. Both of us actually got some help from people in the CIA. And, but what happened here was I had gone to a winter soldier hearing earlier, or about a few months earlier, and heard somebody talk about loading bales or watching bales of opium being loaded onto Air America planes, CIA planes. And when Al came out, he went to Laos and did magnificent work. I mean, his book had a lot of stuff in it, way beyond mine. On his way to Laos, he stayed with me here in Berkeley, and I phoned I had the number of the man who had talked about seeing these bales of opium being loaded on a plane, and I said, "Would you be willing to talk to two of us tomorrow?" And he said, "Sure." He was in Palo Alto, not far away. So we had that phone call. And as far as I know, there had never been any thought of this happening until Al came out and I suggested it, and I made the phone call. And then the next morning we got in the car, we drove to Palo Alto. And as I remember it, and by the way, I completely forgot about this. So I'll come back to that.
Uh-huh.
But as I now recall it, we went up the stairs, knocked on his door, and he came out like this, motioning to be silent. And then pointing down the stairs, we went back down the stairs. We came to his red MG. And there was a hole this big in the steel door of his MG, like this. And then he pointed to the flooring in his MG, which was wood. And he said, and now he's talking, he's got away from his house, and he says, "Look at the floor, it is barely scorched." He said, that had to be an implosion device set by some of the people in my old unit.
Huh.
So what does this mean? This means that somebody overheard our phone conversation, and it ended up with somebody blowing a hole in his door in order to terrorize him into not talking, because he wouldn't say a word to us, because he had been given the message. Now, the real reason I tell that story is not just to say that there's an interaction between people who listen to phone calls and people who blow holes in doors, but that the reaction of Al and me. I was writing about what's wrong with this country. I didn't remember that memory. I completely suppressed that memory because it was just too big to fit with everything else in my mind. And I didn't recover it until about 20 years later. I was writing a poem called "Coming to Jakarta," which the subtitle of which appropriately is a poem about terror. And without getting into the subject matter of too much of the thing, I was recovering memories that I had suppressed. And I realized that we all live by suppressing memories, and that's how we stay sane, because there's so much in the world that would drive us insane if we took it seriously. Just the poverty of people in this country, for example.
Yes.
I mean, we don't really keep that in our minds. It's an intolerable situation. Well, I recovered the memory myself by writing the poem. The next time I saw Al, I asked him about it to see if he had suppressed it. And as I was pretty sure, he had suppressed it too. And to this day, his memory, the latest edition of his masterpiece book, The Politics of Heroin, deals with this episode by quoting my poem.
Wow. Wow.
That's the way of dealing with it. And so that this fact of there are things we repress that we have to recover. That's why I begin by saying that, yes, the deep politics is the product of a system of society which is so unjust that we repress a great deal of what's going on. And the process towards a more healthy, open society will be to recover the repressed memories that will undo some of the products of that repression. like the state of emergency we're in right now, for example, to bring it up to the present. So I think that's the anecdote you wanted, and that's why I think it is a really sort of it represents in a small way, because it was a deep event. I don't understand it fully. I don't know. I don't think it was CIA. Remember, I said the CIA was actually giving us information because it was 1971 is the year that Nixon is about to recognize, go to Beijing and lead to a normalization of China, and that will mean cutting connections to the Kuomintang drug traffickers in Southeast Asia. But somebody didn't like what was going on.
Amazing. That's just so off the charts and really shows you how these people operate. Now, you've had to endure a fair amount of surveillance also for dealing with these sensitive political subjects.
I was then, but they didn't make a secret of it then. I think I still am, but they're more sophisticated now.
Sure.
I actually have had, there was a case where an email with some sensitive material disappeared out of my mailbox in my computer.
Yeah, okay.
And simultaneously, with the email I'd sent to somebody else. That's how I learned, because it disappeared from his mailbox.
Oh.
And he asked me about it, and I said, well, I'll give it to you again. I went, it was gone from my mailbox. That's a pretty tiny thing. I mean, I don't feel oppressed by that.
And you've shared the information at this point, so the books are out there.
Yeah.
They know what you're about.
I want the surveillance. I've always said this. I want them to know what I'm doing because I'm nonviolent.
Yes.
If I became a citizen, I would swear not to overthrow the government by violence, and I would probably also swear to try to overthrow it by nonviolence. But I'm not going to become a citizen, so it's not relevant.
Yes.
But I want them to know. I want the CIA and the FBI and the government to know. I'm not happy about having a private intelligence corporation do surveillance on me, SAIC, for example, because for them there's a profit motive. If they say this man is dangerous and we need to up the surveillance on him, it's profitable for them.
Definitely.
So that's going to contaminate their reporting on me. But if it's the FBI and the CIA, go ahead. I read my computer. There's nothing in there that will get me arrested, I think.
And on that note, I wanted to tell you that I found a clip of you interviewing Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry on the grassy knoll. Now, this is a classic clip from the 70s, and you were asking him about what happened there. And he was in charge of the JFK investigation originally.
Yes, he was in the car.
Right. So we're going to play that clip, but first I wanted to ask you if you remember that day and interviewing him.
Well, I have to respond two ways. First of all, you don't give me time to say you're exaggerating when you say I'm fearless and things like that. But I'm not very fearless, no. I do fairly safe things. And I just want to comment about that camera that took that interview. It was a camera from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Or no, excuse me, the National Film Board in Canada. Because, again, no American network would have allowed that sort of thing. It showed on Canadian television and actually showed I don't know what parts of the show were taken up, but parts of the show were shown in Britain, France, Germany, all over the world, except, of course, in the United States.
Unbelievable.
Where a public broadcasting station took an option on the show and sat on it forever. And so America was the one country which was not allowed to see that film of Police Chief Curry.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, let's see what they were trying to hide. Here's the clip of you and Chief Curry. Here we go.
First shot, approximately right along here. I would say. You didn't look back at that point? No, I looked in the rear view mirror. I see. Now, you've seen the Zapruder film that was taken from up this hill, and there's a very distinct head snap where the President Kennedy's head is hit backwards. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that suggest that the shot would have come from the it would appear to be so. Mm-hmm. And at the same, we also have Dr. Malcolm Perry at Parkland Hospital saying that he examined the wound in the president's throat and it was an entrance wound.
Yes.
Which would also suggest that the shot had come from the front.
I'm not saying that a shot was not fired from here. I'm saying we never found anybody that we could connect with it.
But it does suggest that the evidence that we have, it's in both cases rather strong evidence that there was another assassin involved.
That's right.
That's amazing history there.
All. Governor Connolly, Vice President Johnson, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to have this invitation to address the annual meeting of the Dallas Citizens Council, joined by the members of the Dallas Assembly, for they represent the best qualities, so I am told, of leadership and learning in this city. This link between leadership and learning is indispensable in world affairs. Ignorance or misinformation can handicap the progress of a city or a company, but they can, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicap this country's security. In a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by the lights of learning and reason. Or else, those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain the popular ascendancy with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to all the world problems. Today, voices are heard in the land. Voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality, wholly unsuited to the 60s. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and in all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Thank you.
Time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us, even when pressed by the demands of inner truth. Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. What do they think as we test out our latest weapons on them? Just as the Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe, now that is little left to build on save bitterness. We are met by deep but understandable mistrust. To speak for them is to explain this lack of confidence in Western words, and especially that distrust of American intentions now. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. This way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as one who loves America. To the leaders of our own nation, the great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. A favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
It's been investigated and debated for half a century now, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The official word that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But now for the first time, we're learning that JFK's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General at that time, did not agree with that conclusion, and ABC's Alex Marquardt is on the story. Good morning.
That's right, Dan. It's a remarkable revelation. This is a murder that's been studied more than any other in history. Conspiracy theorists insisting that JFK's assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a bigger plot. And now the stunning assertion by a Kennedy family member that Robert Kennedy also believed it. And his Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was, quote, fairly convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone.
I know that it was a source of the greatest strength to him to know that there were thousands of people all over the United States who were together with him.
Though RFK publicly supported the Warren Commission, according to his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he thought it was, quote, a shoddy piece of craftsmanship. My father thought that somebody was involved, Kennedy Jr. revealed to a Dallas audience. The evidence at this point, I think, is very, very convincing that it was not a lone gunman. Then who? When it was suggested that the culprits could have been the mob or Cubans, Kennedy Jr. added, quote, or rogue CIA agents. He also revealed that his father put his own investigators on the case in search for the truth.
My dear friends and fellow citizens, our dangers have not diminished. Our vigilance cannot be relaxed. But now we have the military, the scientific, and the economic strength to do whatever must be done for the preservation and promotion of freedom. That strength will never be used in pursuit of aggressive ambitions. It will always be used in the pursuit of peace. will never be used to promote provocations. It will always be used to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes. We in this country, in this generation, are by destiny, rather than by choice, the watchmen on the walls of the world of freedom.
The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change.